On a gray Thursday afternoon in Washington, D.C., Pam Bondi, the newly appointed U.S. Attorney General and longtime lightning rod for conservative politics, stepped into the lion's den with the calm of someone who had faced fire before. No entourage. No notes. Just a crisp navy blazer, heels that echoed with quiet confidence, and a look that said, "I know exactly what I'm walking into." What she was walking into was The Point, a high-octane political talk show hosted by Evan Stahl, a progressive media icon who'd made a career out of cornering Republican power players live on air. The same Evan Stahl who once got a sitting senator to storm off set. The same Evan Stahl whose Twitter following dwarfed entire newsrooms. And tonight, his crosshairs were fixed on Pam. Insiders were already calling it a mistake. Her comms team had begged her to reconsider. "There's no upside," one aide warned. "It's not an interview. It's a public hanging." But Bondi wasn't interested in playing defense. If the left wanted a showdown, she'd give them one, just not the kind they were expecting. Inside the studio, the atmosphere was surgical. Cool-toned lights bathed the brick walls. A minimalist set framed the two leather chairs, one for the host, one for the guest. On the shelves behind Stahl's desk, strategically placed progressive tomes caught the camera's eye. How Democracies Die, The New Jim Crow, and a worn hardcover of Rules for Radicals. A set designer's wink. Subtle, pointed. From the control booth, a producer counted down. "We're live in 5, 4. Stahl leaned forward, his signature smirk already in place. Dressed in black, tieless, he resembled a tech CEO turned inquisitor. "Good evening," he said smoothly, facing the camera. "Tonight, we welcome one of the most controversial figures in American politics, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi. A woman whose policies have enraged progressives, delighted hardliners, and reshaped the legal landscape in just 6 short months." He turned to her, smile widening. "Pam, thank you for being here. I'll try to be gentle." She met his gaze without blinking. "I wouldn't expect you to." There was a beat, just long enough for viewers at home to sense it. The line wasn't just witty. It was a challenge. Evan Stahl had no idea what kind of interview this was about to become. He launched in. "Let's talk about the Clean Water Act. Your office declined to intervene in the Montana pipeline dispute. Environmental groups say your inaction amounts to greenlighting ecological disaster. Is that your idea of justice?" Bondi didn't flinch. She shifted slightly in her seat, spine straight, voice level. "My idea of justice is enforcing the law as written, not rewriting it every time a hashtag trends." Evan smiled, but it was thinner now. "Even when the law lets corporations dump waste near drinking water sources?" "Even then," she said coolly. "Because we're a nation of laws, not feelings. And if Congress wants to change that law, they're free to try. But don't ask me to break it on live television." The audience, streaming on YouTube, Twitter, and a dozen left-leaning news sites, lit up. Comments flooded in. Some calling her a monster. Others, a master of the counterpunch. Stahl pivoted. "Hard. All right, let's talk about the Voting Rights Act. Your department supported Georgia's new voter ID law, which disproportionately affects black voters. Critics say that's a 1960s-era suppression tactic in modern packaging." "Critics," she repeated, voice sharpening like a scalpel. "Or activists. There's a difference." Evan leaned in. "What's the difference, Pam?" "One relies on facts. The other relies on outrage." He tried to cut in, but she wasn't done. "And by the way, Georgia's law allows more early voting days than New York, which you've never criticized. Care to explain that?" A flicker passed over his face, not quite surprise. More like recalibration. Bondi wasn't just defending herself. She was counterattacking. And then came the pivot. "What about January 6th? Stahl asked. The tone dropped a register. "Do you think the people who stormed the Capitol were patriots or criminals?" "They're criminals," Bondi said instantly. "And I've said that from day one. Yet your party—" "My party didn't tell them to bring zip ties and threaten elected officials. Those were their choices. And the courts, the ones I respect, are handling them, one by one." Evan blinked. He wasn't expecting that. And Bondi knew it. She took a sip of water, then added, calmly, "But if we're going to talk about riots, Evan, do you want to talk about Portland? Or do we only condemn the ones that happen near senators?" He opened his mouth, but hesitated, just long enough for her to press the advantage. "Or maybe it's easier," she continued, "to pretend that political violence only matters when it fits your narrative." The commercial break signaled in the corner monitor. Evan tried to recover the reins. "We're just getting started," he said. "When we return, immigration, sanctuary cities, and why this Attorney General wants to prosecute journalists." You just smiled. Cool. Unbothered. Because that question, the one about the press, was the one you'd been waiting for. The one that would turn the tables entirely. The second segment opened with a jolt. "Let's talk about journalists," Evan Stahl said, barely waiting for the camera to find him. "You've made headlines for pushing aggressive prosecutions against what some call whistleblowers. Critics say you're weaponizing the Justice Department to silence the press. Are you?" The camera cut to you. Pam Bondi, legs still crossed, posture immaculate, one brow lifting slightly like you'd just been asked if water was wet. "No," you replied. "I'm prosecuting people who leak classified information. There's a difference between journalism and espionage. You want to be Woodward? Great. You want to be Snowden? Pack a toothbrush." Evan smirked. "The problem is, the people you're targeting don't always have access to high-priced lawyers or PR firms. Some of them are just government employees trying to warn the public." "Then they should use legal channels," you countered. "There are whistleblower protections in place. But leaking sensitive intelligence to your buddies at the Post doesn't make you a hero. It makes you a liability." He turned slightly toward the camera, his classic, "let me speak to the nation" body language. "You've said publicly that the media has created a culture of selective truth. What does that mean?" You didn't look at the camera. You stayed locked on him. "It means that outlets like this one," you said evenly, "are more interested in winning the culture war than telling the truth. You cherry-pick statistics, twist words, and label anyone who disagrees with you as racist, fascist, or worse. And you do it with a smile and a graphic package." Evan didn't flinch. Not yet. He was too used to pushback. Too used to controlling the room. But you saw it, the twitch in his temple, the fingers tightening slightly on his cue cards. "Pam," he said, adjusting his tone like a blade being resheathed. "With all due respect, what you're describing sounds more like Fox News than my show." You smiled, just slightly. A smile with teeth. "With all due respect, Evan, I don't think your audience wants to talk about Fox News. They want to talk about why you've never asked a liberal guest one hard question. Why it's considered brave to ask me about race and policing, but not brave to ask a Democrat about the 300% homicide spike in Baltimore." The silence in the control room could have frozen glass. "Or do those lives matter less," you added, voice lower now, "because they can't be weaponized against Republicans?" Evan's mouth opened, then closed. You weren't done. "And you know what's interesting," you said, leaning forward just enough to close the distance. "You have a background in law, right? Harvard. Top of your class. You know full well that federal charges only get filed when there's a rock-solid case. But instead of focusing on facts, you paint everything with this grand moral brush, like you're Moses handing out commandments from your SoundCloud studio." He tried to laugh it off. "That's cute, but nothing," you cut in. "You invited me here to grill me. I get it. But don't pretend it's for the truth. It's for clicks. For narrative. For the echo chamber you've built, where nuance dies and anyone who asks the wrong question gets cancelled." On screen, he tried to reset. "So you're saying you're the victim of media bias?" he asked, tone laced with condescension. You chuckled. "No, Evan. I'm saying that you're not a journalist. You're a character. And like any character, you need a villain to make your audience feel good about themselves. Tonight, that villain is me. And guess what?" you added. "I came anyway." He cleared his throat, flipping to a new card. "Let's pivot," he said, voice brittle now. "You've been accused of supporting policies that disproportionately affect minorities. Voter ID laws, immigration raids, refusal to enforce equity mandates. Can you look into this camera and tell black, Latino, and immigrant communities that you're working in their interest. There it was, the heavy round. The clip he was banking on. You turned to camera. "I can," you said. "And I'll do better than that." You turned back to Evan. "Let me ask you something." He blinked. "How many black voters in Georgia supported voter ID laws?" Evan paused. "I'm not sure of the exact." 74%, you said. According to a University of Georgia poll. 74. And nationwide? Over 80% of all voters support voter ID in some form. But when Republicans back it, you call it racist. Why? He didn't answer. "You know why," you said. "Because it's not about race. It's about control. It's about who gets to define morality on TV. And if anyone pushes back, if a woman like me shows up here and doesn't crumble, you call it cruelty in lipstick." The chat exploded again. The control room was pure static. Evan Stahl had hosted over 1,000 interviews. But this wasn't an interview anymore. This was an interrogation, and he was the one under the lamp. Commercial break. As the cameras cut, Evan reached for his water. His hand was trembling, barely, but enough. "You're good," he said, voice tight. You smiled like a lion who knew the fence was down. "No, Evan," you said, rising slightly from your chair. "I'm just getting started." He was trying to look composed, sipping water, adjusting his notes like the last 10 minutes hadn't just flattened his usual rhythm. But to the trained eye, and you, Pam Bondi, had been trained by far worse than smug hosts in skinny jeans, the cracks were showing. His questions had lost their polish. His timing, off. And his eyes, darting. You knew the signs. He was wounded. But what he didn't know, what no one in the control booth knew, was that you'd been saving something. Not a rebuttal. Not a zinger. A kill shot. The cameras rolled. "We're back," Evan said, smiling just a little too wide. "Pam Bondi, U.S. Attorney General, is with us tonight. She's defended controversial policies, challenged conventional wisdom, and as you've seen, doesn't shy away from a fight." He turned to you, lips curved like a man preparing a dagger. "But Pam," he said smoothly, "let's talk about your record in Florida. Before your time in D.C., you faced criticism for accepting donations from Trump charities while investigating his university. That never made it to court. Care to explain?" He leaned back, certain that this was it, the shift in tone, the stumble, the look away. But you didn't flinch. You smiled. Slowly. Then turned slightly, speaking directly into camera. "Let me tell your audience something they've never heard." Evan blinked. "You want to talk about Trump University?" you said, calm as a surgeon. "Fine. But let's tell the whole story. Not the Twitter version." The case was evaluated. There wasn't evidence of criminal intent in Florida. The New York suit was already underway. Our office chose not to duplicate a case for headlines. That's what prosecutors do. We make calls based on law, not politics. Then you turned to him. "But while we're talking about things the media never reports." And now it was your move. You reached into your blazer pocket, not dramatically, not showily. Just enough for the camera to catch the edge of a manila folder, slim and clean. Evan's smile faltered. You placed it gently on the table between you. "Recognize this?" you asked, voice level. He glanced at it, eyes narrowing. "What is it?" You leaned forward, not breaking eye contact. "It's the HR report from your former newsroom in Chicago. 2012. Silence. Even in the control booth, someone cursed under their breath. The producer leaned into their headset, whispering sharply. Stahl's mic popped with a faint static crackle. "Excuse me," he said, voice suddenly brittle. "3 written complaints," you said, unfolding the top flap. 1 anonymous, 2 named. Female employees. Accusing you of creating what they called, and I quote, "a hostile, condescending work environment for women who disagreed politically." The words dropped like glass onto a marble floor. Evan's jaw tensed. "That's a smear tactic," he snapped. "It was reviewed. No action was taken." You nodded calmly. "Exactly. Reviewed. Not dismissed." Not cleared. Just kept quiet. Just like your producer's NDA in 2017. Would you like me to read the settlement number, or should we skip that part? A flicker of true fear crossed his face. You'd hit him. Square in the narrative. Evan sat back, blinking, reeling. You came here with Oppo research, he asked, his tone jumping an octave. No, you replied. I came here with receipts. Since you made this interview about personal credibility, I thought the viewers deserved the full picture. Stahl tried to recover. Those were internal matters. Irrelevant to... To what? You cut in. To truth. Transparency. The same things you demand from conservatives every day. He opened his mouth, then shut it. You leaned back in your chair, letting the silence wrap around him like a noose. You wanted a villain tonight, Evan, you said, softly. But maybe the audience just met one they didn't expect. His voice, when it returned, was quiet. Those allegations were never proven. So were mine, you said. But yours didn't trend. Mine did. There it was. Not just a clash of ideology, but of power. Narrative. Platform. He had the cameras. You had the truth. And for once, the cameras didn't win. We'll be right back, he said tightly, his voice dry. Final segment after the break. The commercial cue flashed. He tore off his mic and stood up before the lights had faded, storming off set. You sat still. Silent. Composed. The assistant director stared at you, stunned. He's, taking 5. You looked at her, deadpan. He should take 10. The green room was silent. Evan Stahl hadn't returned. His chair remained empty beneath the hot lights, its absence speaking louder than anything he might have said. You, Pam Bondi, were still seated in yours, poised, unbothered, one leg crossed neatly over the other. The control booth was in chaos. Techs whispered, producers paced, and someone dropped a clipboard. No one came near you. No one told you to leave. Because no one knew what to say. Eventually, a producer, the one with the headset and too tight smile, approached, clearly rattled. We're going to end the broadcast early, she said, her tone brittle. We'll edit the final segment before it airs on cable. You glanced up at her, cool and composed. There's nothing to edit. The segment aired just fine. She hesitated. Evan, he's not coming back out. You stood slowly, gathering the slim manila folder and tucking it back into your bag. That's probably wise. She looked like she wanted to say something more, to ask if you planned it, if you knew exactly how this would unfold. But the question hung in the air, unanswered. You gave her a polite nod, and walked off the set without looking back. The next day in Washington, the fallout began. Cable news was abuzz. Not with the show, not with what Evan asked, but with how it ended. Clips of the confrontation made every morning roundtable. Analysts on both sides of the aisle, normally allergic to agreeing on anything, found themselves aligned on one thing. Pam Bondi didn't just hold her own. She dominated. Your team issued no statement. You didn't do a victory lap. You gave no interviews that day, and took no calls from friendly pundits. You didn't need to. The footage spoke for itself. By the following week, Evan Stahl had quietly stepped back from hosting duties. A substitute anchor filled in. The official line, family leave. But no one believed that. Not really. Meanwhile, you returned to business at the Justice Department like nothing had happened. Meetings. Policy reviews. Hearings on Capitol Hill. At one Judiciary Committee session, a senator tried to needle you on the tone of your interview. You met his gaze, steady as ever. I thought it was respectful, you said. I let the host speak uninterrupted. I answered every question. And I brought facts. The senator shifted in his seat, sensing no opening. By month's end, a new whisper was moving through the West Wing. One staffer said it plainly, she's a problem solver. And she doesn't blink. Another added, with a raised eyebrow, she walked into a hit piece and left with the host's show on life support. But the most telling moment came behind closed doors, a private meeting with the chief of staff and 2 senior advisors. The discussion turned to future court appointments. One of them asked, almost casually. "What about Bondi?" Silence. Then a single reply. "She doesn't need a robe to be dangerous." 3 weeks later, you stood beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Justice Department's main hallway, waiting for a motorcade that would take you to a federal crime summit. A young aide jogged to catch up with you. "Ma'am, I still can't believe what happened on the point," he said, breathless. "You really—" You stopped him with a glance. "I didn't go there to destroy anyone," you said calmly. "I went there to answer questions." He nodded, flushed. "Of course. It's just, the whole thing was brutal." You paused at the elevator, pressing the button, then turned to him. "It's only brutal if you lie." The doors slid open. You stepped in, alone. And the truth, as always, followed you in.